This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 88. Today's episode is brought to you by my new Fertility Boost group program. My group program includes 6 to 8 women who are also looking for a deeper understanding of fertility awareness and wanting to improve their cycles naturally. If you're listening to this episode when it's airing, then you should know that registration is opening in the last week of July in 2016. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/programs for more information and to reserve your spot. And if you're listening to this episode after July 2016, just head over to fertilityfriday.com/programs and find out when the next group program is starting and also to get on the wait list. Welcome to the 88th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I started this podcast because I believe that every woman has the right to know exactly how her body and her fertility works. I'm here to connect you with the tools and information that you need to improve your menstrual cycle health and fertility, and I feel so privileged to be able to share my passion for body literacy and fertility awareness with you every single week. Fertility awareness is so much more than just birth control or trying to get pregnant, because it truly gives you a window into your own health and fertility. And I love sharing my expertise with my clients and helping them to understand their charts and connect with their cycles. If you've recently discovered fertility awareness but you're not feeling confident about using it for birth control just yet, or you've been charting for a while and you're having trouble making sense of what's happening in your cycle, I can help. Get started today with a free 15-minute consultation with me by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/coaching, or just click on the Work With Me button on my website. And I would also like to invite you to sign up for the Fertility Friday newsletter. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/ebook, and as a gift to you, you'll receive a free copy of my new ebook, where I reveal what to expect when coming off of hormonal contraceptives, and I share 5 steps to restoring healthy menstrual cycles post-pill. And today I'm happy to welcome my guest, Heidi Hayes, to the show. Heidi is the CEO of Donor Egg Bank USA. Donor Egg Bank was launched to assist fertility patients in their dream of having a baby. And Heidi struggled with infertility herself, and after many years of trying to conceive, she ultimately built her family through adoption and donor egg treatment. And that was one of the reasons that inspired her to start this company. So in today's show, we'll be talking about egg donation and IVF and delving a bit into Heidi's own experience with infertility and what inspired her to create Donor Egg Bank USA. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Heidi.
Oh, thank you, Lisa, for having me. I'm excited to be talking about donor egg.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to have you on the show because it's not one of the topics that I've gone into in depth. As I had talked to you before we started recording, I've touched on it with a few of my guests, but never really just gone for it. So I'm really excited to chat with you. But before we get started, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the listeners and just talk a little bit about how it all came about, how you founded this company.
So my husband and I, we, like many of your listeners, we tried naturally when we were in our late 20s and early 30s. And by the time I was about 32, we were unsuccessful for a number of years in having a baby, and we didn't really know why. So we went to see our fertility doctor. We started with the IUIs and many of the less technical treatments without success. We were actually diagnosed with unexplained infertility. We moved on to IVF. We had multiple IVF cycles. I actually miscarried twice, got pregnant, never saw the heartbeat. So we had biochemical pregnancies. And my doctor told me that we should move on to doing donor egg. I was only at that point, I was 34, and I just couldn't bring myself to think about utilizing an egg donor. And it was very expensive. We didn't have a lot of money. So we moved forward with an adoption. And thankfully, we were successful in our adoption. We adopted through Guatemala. We went forward with a second adoption through Guatemala, and all of the laws changed. The U.S. signed the Hague Treaty, which impacted our adoption in Guatemala. And ultimately, we were unable to bring that adoption to success. After 6 years, we were notified by Homeland Security that we would not be bringing our daughter home, who we had traveled to visit, we loved. And as you can imagine, it was probably the most devastating point in my life.
Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine what
it
that
was.
Been like.
It was horrible. The miscarriages were bad. There's nothing quite like holding a baby in your arm and believing that that baby is going to be part of your family to not bring her home. So we were devastated. We considered doing an adoption again, but we felt like failures every step of the way. We failed at IUI, we failed at IVF, we failed at adoption, and there was only donor egg left. We decided to move forward with utilizing an egg donor, and we were successful on our first try. So that's the first point I want to make about egg donation is it's a highly successful treatment. By the time most women get to egg donation, and I should say not just women, but couples in general, they're typically broken. They are feeling like nothing will work, and it is a highly successful treatment. So it gave a ray of hope. We ended up having twins, and that's really what brought me to wanting to launch Donor Egg Bank USA. Technology has changed. Prior to the early 2000s, we were not able to successfully freeze eggs efficiently. Eggs are the largest cell in the body, and they are primarily created of water. And in the cryopreservation process, that water crystallizes and it impacts the egg and it compromises the quality. So there were some births, but it might take a lot of eggs in order to produce that birth. With vitrification, which we'll talk more about as we move forward, that's a fast freeze process, and it allows the egg to maintain its integrity and to be very effective in creating babies. So I was so excited about this advance in the technology. And like sperm banks, I really wanted to see egg banks being launched. I wanted women to have greater access to egg donation at a lower cost because it is highly successful. And for many couples and for gay men as well, or other members of the LGBT community, it is the optimum way to have a baby.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. As I said, what you experienced is so traumatic. Having miscarriages, as many of our listeners can empathize and have experienced that as well. I've experienced miscarriage as well. It's so common. But just the thought of, wow, and she's still out there, so that's heartbreaking. There's so many things that you said that I want to delve into. So I think I just wanted to start kind of just so that we can get a little bit of a picture. So when you finally did do egg donation, about how old were you at that time?
I did egg donation when I was 40, and I actually delivered my twins when I was 41.
Okay. And do you know approximately the age of the egg donor, or are you privy to that type of information?
I actually do have that information. I can't remember how old she was. It wasn't something that I focused on. Most egg donors are between the ages of 21 and 32. I had a good understanding of fertility. I knew that fertility dropped in women at age 34. So I wasn't concerned with the age of the egg donor, just as long as she was within those parameters.
Okay. Well, the reason that I asked, I think one of my very first interviews that I did, I think it was, I'll have to double check what podcast number, but I'll link it in the show notes. But it was specifically around infertility. And there were a lot of stats given about age and how it relates to fertility. And I think one of the interesting things was that if a woman uses donor eggs from a younger woman, if she herself is older, then that can change the odds of her carrying a pregnancy. Is that correct?
So what we do with Donor Egg Bank USA is we will take a first-time donor between the ages of 21 and 28 so that you are looking at that optimal fertility time period. But I think we need to look at fertility on a spectrum. There are those women that are super fertile. And I think we all have a friend that she's this way. She looks at her husband across the room and she has a baby. And so then there are those of us that could try and try and try again, and we just can't seem to have a baby. So fertility runs a spectrum. There's super fertile, and then there is less fertile. So the goal in identifying an egg donor between the ages of 21 and 28 for a very first time is to ensure that she's fertile. Those women that will go forward at 21 to 28 and have offspring or donor-conceived children from their donations, they're very good to move forward on to 32. So your repeat donors between ages 28 and 32, I think, are a very safe bet as well.
Okay. Well, so one of the things that you talked about that I want to deepen into a little bit is how successful egg donation is versus typical IVF. So why would a woman see better results, obviously being more successful in becoming pregnant and carrying that pregnancy to term using donor eggs versus IVF using her own eggs?
Because you are using the eggs of a young woman. So if you have tried for multiple months to become pregnant or you've miscarried multiple times, typically there is something going on in that situation. If your doctor has diagnosed male factor, then there's no concern about the eggs. But if you're unexplained infertility or they know, in fact, that is an issue with the eggs due to advanced maternal age or perhaps a decline in the ovarian reserve, then egg donation is a great bet because it is more successful. We are looking at more normal fertility rates due to the age of the donor, as well as for a donor that has done multiple cycles, if she falls into that very fertile range, then that increases your odds of having a baby.
So it's so interesting that the age of the actual egg increases a woman's chances of conceiving through IVF, an IVF procedure. So if she herself is outside of that optimal kind of age range and she obviously has been struggling with infertility, generally speaking, that's why women are looking into these options. Not in every case, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yes.
I find that to be really interesting that the age of the egg then would improve her chances to conceive successfully and carry that pregnancy to term.
Right. And most fertility practices don't have women in their 20s coming in for fertility services.
Well, naturally. So we wouldn't necessarily even be able to compare that.
Correct.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Because then, yeah, we're only seeing women, first of all, who have been having problems to begin with, and secondly, who are a little bit older in age.
And if there's a woman that goes into her fertility practice in her 20s, typically there is an explanation, and it may be male factor or it could be bilateral tubal blockage. So there's nothing wrong with her egg.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, and I wanted you to talk about the difference between, say, fresh versus frozen. So actually, a friend of mine recently donated her eggs. It was a fresh transfer. So she had to be physically, present. And then, I don't know what the right word is, harvested her eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so it was like a live, fresh transfer that happened. So what is the difference then? If a woman is able to find a donor who is kind of available and there, and the eggs are fresh versus if you're going to a bank and getting frozen eggs.
So let me share that the beginning of this process is exactly the same between fresh and frozen, and then I'll help you understand the differences between the two. But first of all, egg donors are screened exactly the same way, regardless if we freeze their eggs or they're utilized fresh. That egg donor goes through a multi-generational family review. She fills out an application. She's tested for infectious diseases. We choose to do drug testing as well as a full genetic panel of 104 genetic carrier types. We do psychological screening. She sees a social worker. She has her ovarian reserve tested. She has a pap smear. So there's a lot of things that the donor does to ensure that we're dealing with a woman that is psychologically prepared to donate her eggs, as well as she's healthy and ready to go. And that happens regardless if we freeze her eggs or she does a fresh cycle. In the fresh cycle, a recipient, meaning the woman that's going to receive the eggs, and with a gay couple, this can also be a gestational carrier, or for a heterosexual couple that needs a carrier as well. That woman's menstrual cycle is synchronized with the donor's menstrual cycle. And once those cycles are on the same day and they're synchronized together, then they'll go ahead and trigger the maturation of the eggs. They'll go in and retrieve the eggs from the egg donor and couple those eggs that are retrieved with the sperm. Embryos are made, and ultimately 3 to 5 days later, the recipient, the woman receiving the eggs, will come in for the transfer. Where this differs with a frozen cycle is that the donor on her own time frame, when it's convenient for her, chooses to have her cycle. So she might plan to have her cycle over spring break. Those eggs are retrieved from her and they're frozen and they're put in the cryopreservation tank and they're kept there. When a recipient or gestational carrier is ready to have her cycle, those eggs are removed from the tank, they're thawed, and then they can actually plan when the transfer will be within 2 days. So you might be able to say, you know something, I'm a teacher and I really want to have my cycle start in June so that I can be pregnant over that time period, and that can be planned ahead of time. The great thing about an egg bank, which opens up the possibility of having egg donors from anywhere in the country. So we currently have over 180 donors on our website. So it's a broader pool of egg donors. So you've increased your likelihood of finding an egg donor that looks like you, might have some of the characteristics you're looking for, or those hard to find donors such as Asian or Jewish may be more accessible via an egg bank. Those eggs are then shipped to your fertility practice so that you can stay with your doctor and you can have those eggs thawed in your laboratory.
Wow, that's, again, so many interesting things that you're talking about there. I wanted to kind of dial back. I'm always kind of going back to the basics. So you had mentioned that in a fresh transfer, the donor and recipient, their cycles are synchronized. Would you just explain briefly how it's done? How are they synchronized?
Both the egg donor and the recipient are put onto birth control pills. And we always know it sounds crazy. You're going to go on birth control pills in order to get pregnant. But they go on birth control pills, and through the birth control pills, we get them on the same cycle. So we forced those periods to align so that day one is on the same day.
Okay. And you did talk about some of the screening that you do for the donors. So maybe you could paint us a picture. So who's your ideal donor? Just in a few words. So what does an ideal donor look like? What characteristics are best?
So donors vary. Typically, of everyone that applies to be a donor, less than 10% of women will actually make it through the process. And I think that's an important thing to notate, because if you are selecting a donor that has not been screened yet and you're considering a fresh cycle, you need to be prepared that the process can take 6 to 12 months because you might have a donor screen out. We've had cases where couples have had more than 5 donors screen out before they actually had a donor ready to be able to move through the process. So an ideal donor is a female that meets the age parameters, has an ovarian reserve that is appropriate for her age or on the high side. We want her to have a clean medical history, not that any of us don't have anything in our background, but we're looking for multiple red flags. We don't want to have multi-generational breast cancer, for example. We're looking for a history of depression. We want to remove those donors that have those types of challenges. We like donors to be motivated for the right reasons. Typically, these are women that want to give back. Sometimes they've undergone an abortion and they're trying to make up for that. Or they know somebody that's gone through infertility and they want to be a donor because they want to help another woman have a baby. So we're looking for all of those components together. A donor can be ruled out due to her infectious disease testing. She may test as a false positive for syphilis. Approximately 5% of donors will have a false positive test. But according to the Food and Drug Administration, we still need to exclude that donor. She may never move forward with a egg donor cycle. The donor may be a genetic carrier for what's referred to as an X-linked disease. An X-linked disease is the type of disease that is only passed through the female line. So we don't want to have a carrier type being passed from donor to donor conceived offspring. We also exclude for things like cystic fibrosis or Fragile X. From time to time, we'll exclude sickle cell if the female is African American, because we know that that's very prevalent within that community. So there are many reasons why we'll exclude a donor. When you're looking at a frozen egg bank donor, to go through that process, we always want to ensure that she's selectable.
Okay. And do you do this because it's linked to more positive outcomes? So these women, then, if you're screening out for all these things, it's then more likely that the transfer itself will be successful?
Not necessarily, because when you have an egg donor come through, you really can't completely predict her fertility unless she has offspring on her own. But we want to ensure that any donor conceived child is going to be healthy as much as possible. There will always be genetic abnormalities that are going to occur, but if we can try to identify issues, we want to do that prior to egg donation.
Okay. And is she paid? How does that work?
Good question. Egg donors are compensated for their time and inconvenience. Donor compensation varies throughout the United States. As one would suspect, egg donor compensation is higher in places like New York City, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and lower in some of the Midwest areas, as well as Arizona and, Nevada, Idaho. So where a donor lives makes a difference in how much she's paid, but it's really for her time and inconvenience and not a payment for her eggs themselves.
Okay. Well, because that gets into ethical questions. So, because I think that also part of that screening process, I mean, if you could get paid to donate your eggs and the screening process was kind of lax, then you'd end up with women who are motivated by that. And obviously that's not what you want.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So earlier you mentioned something about what you called vitrification. So I don't know what that is, but you were talking about the freezing process and the medical advancements that have happened that make this freezing process more successful and also make the eggs viable instead of destroying them. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so vitrification is the new way of freezing eggs. Prior to vitrification, we had what's now referred to as the slow freeze process, in which the eggs were subjected to cryoprotectants very slowly to bring down the temperature of the egg until it was frozen. And that process allowed ice crystals to develop inside the egg, which then compromised the integrity of the egg. In 2003, two gentlemen in Japan really made vitrification a very routine process. Vitrification itself dates back to the early mid-90s. It was really piloted in Japan and Italy, but it was Kuwayama and Kitazato in 2003 that really made it routine. And it sparked a revolution in cryopreservation. Less than 10 years later, we have the American Society of Reproductive Medicine in 2012 deemed the technique no longer experimental, which really paved the way for donor egg banking and elective egg freezing. I don't think there are many women that haven't heard about elective egg freezing. We know that Facebook and Google and many of these big companies are really running down the path of egg freezing for their employees, and it's becoming a increasingly popular thing to do if you have not found the right partner. Perhaps you're undergoing medical conditions such as oncology treatment, to freeze your eggs prior to your about the age of 38.
Well, and outside of the cool sciencey part of it, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on encouraging women to freeze their eggs at a young age? Do you feel like it's all positive? Do you feel like it could kind of create a little bit of mass hysteria for women to be doing this? Do you think that it could create false hope because nothing's guaranteed? So if I was 20 and I was freezing my eggs, what are my chances really of that being successful? Say, if I find myself in my 40s and finally find my partner and then I'm not able to conceive naturally.
I believe we need to do a better job of educating women as to their fertility potential. So a woman under the age of her early 30s, I would say, 32 or 33, she should just continue to what she's doing. This is my own personal opinion. Perhaps my opinion is going to be different than a medical physician, but knowing that women's fertility rates remain pretty good up until age 34, all things being equal, if she's an average female, she's pretty safe up until those early 30s. If she is not married, she's sure she wants children, or in the cases, again, of a medical reason, then I would recommend she consider freezing her eggs. But here's the caveat. It is a false sense of hope if she goes to a location to freeze her eggs that is not experienced in the technique. Donor Egg Bank USA, we have, through our network of fertility practices, we've frozen literally tens of thousands of eggs. And we know that nearly 50% of embryologists, no matter how good they are, even with a PhD behind their name, will need to be retrained. This is a highly fickle technology. It's difficult to master. When I talk to physicians about this technique to help them understand, I always use the analogy of a world-class baseball team. You can have everybody on that team that's absolutely superior and fantastic, but only a couple people on that team are uniquely qualified to hit the strike zone as a pitcher over and over and over again. And that's what an embryologist is when they do vitrification. They have to be able to have the exact technique every single time, and it is a difficult skill set to master.
So then, unless someone is versed in this type of technique, which it's different, you said it's fast freezing, and of course the science is going to not necessarily go over my head, but maybe within the span of our conversation here, it probably will. But just safe to say, it's a specific technique, and unless someone has been trained in it, the viability of the eggs, if just done in the regular way, would be just significantly lower. Like your chances would be a lot lower, is what you're saying?
That is correct. So in 2014, there were over 6,000 fertility preservation cycles that women went in to have their eggs frozen purposefully, electively. I think the concerning thing is that many laboratories are freezing eggs, but they have never thawed anything. So that also is equally challenging. But if you froze it, but you've never really practiced the thaw side of it, you really don't know how those eggs will ultimately do. And survival isn't everything. We've seen embryologists that have frozen eggs. We get beautiful survival, but the embryos themselves just fall apart by day 2 or by day 3. And it's because the egg was compromised or had, we refer to it as chill injuries on the egg. It wasn't enough to cause the egg not to survive, but it was enough to cause the egg coupled with the sperm to not develop into a viable embryo.
So it sounds like we still have a ways to go with that. Coming from kind of a non-medical perspective, sometimes I wonder, and again, this is just my own kind of musings in my head, if, there's a lot of people out there, because it's expensive, freezing your eggs is not going to be cheap as far as I know. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the cost of something like that. But it's a concern of mine that, are people kind of advertising this because it's popular and because it's becoming more of a common idea and kind of capitalizing on women's fears around their fertility instead of a society that equally promotes how to actually improve your fertility naturally, to give women a good shot either way, right?
Correct. It's the only growing segment of the fertility business market. So I would caution anyone listening to the podcast to, and I'm going to bring this full circle for you, go to a program that is skilled in dealing with frozen donor eggs. And the reason why you want to go back to the frozen donor egg process, even if you're considering freezing your own eggs, is because there's experience in both freezing those eggs and then immediately, within typically 6 months, those eggs are being thawed again. And we can see how the quality is. We can take a look at how good the technique was in both the freezing and then ultimately in the warming. So you want to have a program that is experienced both in freezing eggs and in warming them. And the best way to do that is to look at the donor population to determine good quality.
Well, that made me think of something. So is there an expiry date? How long can an egg be frozen?
Oh, that's a really great question. We believe they can be frozen indefinitely. However, the earliest cases of egg freezing using vitrification only date back 10 years or so. So, while we know that these babies are moving into their childhood, they're probably not beyond, the oldest are probably not beyond the fifth grade. We don't really know a lot about any questionable genetic abnormalities from the egg freezing, nor do we really know how long the eggs can be frozen. But the great thing is that early results are reassuring. There is really nothing coming through the research that says that they can't be frozen indefinitely or that there's any greater impact on a donor conceived child and their ultimate health from freezing the eggs. So we're encouraged and excited.
It's so interesting. It's really fascinating. I mean, to think about that for a second. They can actually freeze an egg and it can kind of hang out and can have a baby years later. It's really fascinating. It boggles the mind.
I think it's so exciting for us as women, though, because men have been able to freeze their sperm for years and years. And for the first time, we can harness our own fertility potential as women to be able to have a good chance at having a baby when the time is really right for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting parallel as well, because there have been sperm banks for so long. That's a really good point. And so to kind of switch gears just a little bit and going back to, who's a good candidate. So maybe you could talk about who is a good candidate then to be the recipient. Is there an ideal, situation there? And when would a woman maybe not be, like, who would not be appropriate then for these to be the recipient of donor eggs?
So recipients vary. Typically, we're working with women that are over the age of 38 and up until around 50. Most practices will end treatment at 50. There are a handful that will take a female to the age of 55. If a female's in her 20s, typically it's diminished ovarian reserve is her challenge. We work with many gay men. We work with some lesbian couples that one will actually be the egg donor and the other one will be the recipient. So it varies. Most people consider donor egg, though, one of the more advanced fertility treatment options in the under assisted reproductive technologies. So many couples have actually had a long history of lack of success in the fertility process by the time they get to egg donation.
Okay. And maybe you could comment a little bit on how prevalent it is. So there would have been a time when this wouldn't have been very common at all, and where the idea of it would seem strange. And I find, in my own life, it's just more and more common. So more and more you're having a casual conversation with somebody who mentions that they had donor eggs or that they, used egg donation. So maybe you could comment on how common it's getting, how prevalent it is, and maybe why attitudes are changing around using donor eggs.
Well, I'm excited that you had a casual conversation that someone actually said that they did egg donation. I think we still struggle in this community that it's something that we don't talk much about. As I shared at the beginning of the podcast, I felt a bit like a failure. So it's something that I do tell people. Obviously, I'm telling on a whole podcast, but I'm not announcing it at the PTA, but I will own it if someone asks me about it. Women are, for the most part, historically, we're delaying childbearing as a whole segment of society. So women are having children later in life. I also believe that egg donation is growing because of what's happened within the adoption community. So my understanding is that children being given up for adoption have hit a historical low. So you have fewer babies being adopted out. We have a growing society in which we're comfortable raising children. So if a young woman has a baby outside of wedlock, either she is raising the child or perhaps her parents are raising that child. We've had international laws change for adoption, so babies are less available from an international perspective. And coupled with the concept that having babies in your 40s is really a kind of in vogue process, we can look at many celebrities that are now in their late 40s having babies. So egg donation is increasingly popular as a route to have a baby, but I don't believe that we're talking about it as much as I wish we would.
Do you sense that there's a parallel to the way that people used to look at adoption? Because I feel like that's what's coming up for me right now. There was a time when if a person adopted a baby, they would make every point to adopt a baby that looked as much like the family as possible and not really tell people that the baby was adopted and not necessarily even tell the child. And so is there a parallel then to egg donation in terms of, the shame, feeling like you're not able to conceive and kind of like a failure, like you said, finding an egg donor that looks as much like you as possible and then not telling people because of those feelings of shame?
I believe that's actually decreasing. We have increasingly number of individuals that plan to tell their children. It is something that the psychologists encourage is to talk about it. There are books on the market to talk to your child about being donor conceived. I believe, like adoption, we're moving into a more transparent, a more open society. I'm encouraged and excited about it. But there are a few people that we talk to them every week that have no intention of ever telling their children. And they'll go on vacation, they'll have their transfer, and, it'll be an exciting thing to tell family that they got pregnant while on vacation.
And what are your thoughts on that? It's every person's choice to decide how they're going to handle it, but what are your thoughts on that?
It is every person's choice, but I always take the perspective of the donor conceived offspring. So we require that every couple that tells us that they don't plan to tell the child, we still require that they keep a copy of the donor's application. I usually suggest they put it in a safety secure box at a bank so that they have it when needed. I don't think we can predict necessarily every child's response as they get older, if they need the information or if they don't. So it's good to have it. I'm a proponent of talking to children about their roots and helping them to understand why their parents chose to go through egg donation versus keeping it secret.
I think I really agree with you. My personal opinion, I can't really, judge anybody else for making the choices that they make because you don't, know what's going on around all those things. But I feel like it'd be harder to keep the secret, harder to keep the lie. And it would imply that there's something to be ashamed of if you're keeping the secret. And I don't really think that there is. I remember this one time a while ago, and I don't know if you saw this episode of Oprah, but it was really interesting. So there was this episode of Oprah that I watched a long time ago, and there were all of these children that were conceived through a sperm bank. And there were different families and different ways that people would handle it. So there was this one gentleman who had been a sperm donor for years, and he had like all these kids. Obviously, he didn't raise them, but he had left it open so that they could contact him if they wanted to. And so all of these children, had this kind of relationship with their donor father, and they were able to be privy to the health information, those types of things. And then they contrasted it with children who were not given that information. So sperm donors who closed it off and didn't, allow for any type of contact. And I saw so much, pain just in those children. They were angry. And, they'd often say that, I want to know what my family's health history is. I don't have the ability to know if my parents had a history of heart disease or, whatever the case is. And I would often think to myself that it's more than that. But of course, we want to know what the health history is, right?
I think you're absolutely right, because the danger is that you have a donor conceived offspring who is telling their doctor what their family history is, and treatment plans are being created based on that family history when in fact it's not the family history at all. It's only one side of it. So that's where I have been challenged with our own children. your knee-jerk response is to start down your own family line. And then you have to remember, and I'll have to say, oh, let me double check the donor profile. I have to let you know if she wore glasses as a young girl. I just don't remember.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because I wouldn't even necessarily think of it that far. And being in the doctor's office, and, especially a lot of the things I talk about on the podcast, are natural practitioners, functional health practitioner. So if any of the listeners have ever gone to a functional health practitioner, or even client who are learning fertility awareness who come to see me, they fill out this lengthy form. I filled out 10-page forms about my family history when I'm seeing my naturopath, where it asks you all of this stuff about your maternal and paternal parents and grandparents, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's huge. So kind of, I guess, getting back to what we were talking about egg donation, maybe you could talk about the success rates. And so if a woman is seeking egg donation, kind of like you said, typically at the last straw, unless it's a different situation, what can she typically expect in terms of how successful this might be?
Frozen eggs are as good as fresh eggs, but they're not better. There's nothing inherent in the freezing or the thawing process that actually makes the egg better. And that's a key thing to remember. So with the fresh eggs, typically you're getting all the eggs. So it might be many eggs, or it could actually be just a few eggs. It all depends on how a donor does. With a frozen egg option, you're getting a set number of eggs from the egg bank that are being shipped to you. I can tell you the Donor Egg Bank USA success rate, we have, if with one set of approximately 6 eggs, you have a 52% likelihood of actually delivering a live birth. So going forward. Now, that includes both the initial transfer and if there was a subsequent frozen embryo transfer, it's probably going to be in excess of 52%. We have a number of frozen embryos that have yet to be transferred and move forth, but it's highly successful. The quality can vary by fertility practice. Like I said, it all depends on how well you can hit that strike zone each and every time and how well you can thaw those eggs. So you would want to talk to your physician and look at the success rates of every practice that you're considering. We have practices that are delivering a live birth rate in excess of 60%. And we have some practices that are delivering a live birth rate around 30%. So it varies by laboratory.
And can we just break that down a little bit just to make sure I'm understanding? So you said, for instance, 6 eggs if they're frozen. So does that mean that, because if I'm coming in to be the recipient, you're not putting 6 eggs in me at one time, are you?
No. So those 6 eggs are obviously thawed, then they are made into embryos. So we keep our data on our website so everyone can see it. So in 2015, we did 852 transfers of embryos. Okay. We used about 1.5 embryos for every transfer. Obviously, we didn't cut them in half. Some women got 2, but the majority got 1 embryo in her transfer. And 63% of the women that received the embryo in their uterus got pregnant. But as we all know, not every pregnancy moves on to a heartbeat. 50% of the women that had a transfer actually went and saw the heart beating on the screen. But there's also a natural miscarriage rate. So 63 women had a miscarriage. So the live birth rate that they actually at the hospital had a baby that was born alive is 42%. I'm going to go even a little deeper to say 54% of the women had excess embryos. They had their transfer, but they had even more embryos left over cryopreserved. Some of those women went in and had another transfer. And so that lifts that live birth rate to more than 52%. Okay. We now have couples that had one egg group of 6 eggs. They had a baby born. They went back in and had a frozen embryo transfer that was left over from those 6 eggs. And they now have a second baby that's been born.
Well, thank you for breaking down the statistics. I think that it can be misleading I think that, as you know, there's certain websites you go to where you see these statistics and they're not broken down in that way. And so it would lead women to think that 63% of the time you're going to have a baby, which isn't the case from the initial transfer. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a woman who goes through an IVF procedure that doesn't think it's going to work. I mean,
right.
You're paying all that money. And I want to get into that. I want to ask you how much all of this costs. But I feel like there's some degree of misconception around IVF when women are going into it, because I have never met a woman who didn't believe that their first IVF treatment would work, regardless of even being told the statistics. Because, of course, you're not going to go through this and pay all that money for it not to work.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing that doesn't make it any less devastating when it doesn't.
Right. I think the challenge is that every fertility practice sometimes reports pregnancy rates differently. We all get focused on getting pregnant, but we know that you can get a positive beta test, or, you can get the stick that shows the double mark that you're pregnant. There's a high miscarriage rate between that and the actual seeing the heartbeats on the screen. That's called the fetal heartbeat or a clinical pregnancy. And I tell people all the time, it's not just about getting pregnant. It's about being able to take that pregnancy all the way to the live birth.
Mm-hmm.
So I had what was 2 biochemical pregnancies, meaning, yes, I was pregnant. We had a high beta, but I never got to the point where I saw the heartbeat on the screen.
Mm-hmm. Knowing all this stuff, though, it doesn't change how you feel about it. But at least if going into it, you have all that information, then it's not any less devastating, but at least maybe it can help you to understand it a little bit better. So I did want to ask you then, so what is the cost of all of this?
Okay.
So we're talking about donor eggs, so frozen or fresh. We're talking about the cost, if it's fresh, then does the donor, contribute to the cost or does the recipient contribute to the cost of the donor? And then on top of that, we're talking about IVF and multiple procedures where the eggs are being put into the woman's uterus. So let's talk about money.
Okay. So fresh donation is more expensive. So let's start there. It runs on average in the United States anywhere between $25,000 and $40,000. The costs that go into it is typically a fee to an agency, and that fee to an agency can run anywhere between $4,500 to $6,500. If you're looking at a specialty agency for, let's say, Asian or Jewish, you're at a much higher end. In fact, your cost could go way north of $40,000. So you have the agency fee, then you have all the pre-screening of that donor. Remember how I said not every donor will get through the pre-screening. So you may be paying for multiple donors to have a medical workup to determine if they can be a donor. Then you may have travel for the donor if the donor doesn't live in your area, and a hotel for her and all of her expenses. If she lives in your area, that cost will obviously come down a little bit because you won't be paying that. You have the cost for her medication that can run anywhere between probably about $3,000 to $5,000. You have the cost for her IVF cycle itself, and then you have your own cost, which would be your pre-screening cost to determine if you can move forward into a egg donation cycle, the preparation of your uterine lining. You have the actual coupling cost to make the embryos. You have what's referred to as the embryo culture, which is where they're growing those embryos to day 3 or day 5 so that they're ready to have a transfer. And then you have your transfer cost. So it can be very expensive. Frozen egg is less expensive, and here's why. The cost that you paid to the agency gets shared among multiple people. The cost that gets paid to the donor for her compensation gets shared among multiple people. The cost of her IVF cycle and her medication is shared among multiple people. So the cost is lower because you're sharing those costs. With a really well-selected egg donor, we might get as many as 24 mature eggs. And then those eggs can be shared across, let's say, 4 different people. So the cost of the egg donor herself and the entire process can be shared 4 ways, making the cost lower overall.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well.
I should also share an average frozen donor egg cycle for the eggs themselves range in the United States between typically about $13,000 and $17,000 for just the eggs. I can tell you for our program through Donor Egg Bank USA, we like to couple it up as a package. So we put the whole package together on average in the United States runs $18,000, a little higher in a few markets and a little lower in other markets.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big cost. Definitely a big cost. And I know on your website you have payment plans and things like that. I think a lot of couples struggle with this because, you want to have a baby, of course. And that is as much as a car or a down payment on a house. In some states, it's the cost of a house itself.
So the cost of one fresh egg donation cycle, we created what's called the Assured Refund Plan because nobody goes into this process not wanting a baby. So we decided to create a risk modeled plan with the couples going through to keep us all on the same page. Basically, you can get up to 6 egg bank cycles, all those frozen embryo transfers included for one set fee. If you are unsuccessful in delivering a live birth, remember, not pregnancy, because it's all about having a baby in your arms. So we want to have a live birth. We give you your money back. So it's a 100% money back guarantee. If you don't have a live birth, you do get your money back so that you can do something else. We like the plan because it protects a couple from any challenges in the process, and it ensures that they're financially kept whole at the end. Some couples will be successful on the very first try. They've paid too much for the process, but no one complains because they had a baby and they're excited about that. Some couples will go 4, 5, maybe 6 tries. They've paid way too little, and sometimes they even get their money back. No one complains because they had multiple tries, they had a lot of medical services, and they had their money back. So it's a good plan for everyone involved. I like to, when I talk about it, like to talk about that it's a luxury vehicle that you will never drive, but you'll either have your baby in your arms or you'll have your money back to try something different.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's just an amazing kind of acknowledgement of what this is about. And not the feeling that this is a cash grab, right? This is a feeling that we really want to help couples who are struggling to conceive to have this option. So is it like an insurance thing, the way you think of insurance, that everybody pays? Some people need it, some people don't.
Yeah, if you can choose to be in the plan. It's just a really great way to ensure that we're all aligned. It's our goal to get you pregnant and have a baby. It's your goal to get pregnant and have a baby. It's your doctor's goal to get you pregnant and have a baby. It just puts us all together in a win-win situation. It comes back to my heart as to why I wanted to bring Donor Egg Bank USA to market. It's because I suffered through this process. I want to help other couples be successful. I know how during my infertility journey, I wasn't really living life. We were plodding through thinking that we'll start living when we have a baby. And, it took nearly 10 years to make that happen. And that was 10 years of my life lost, wishing that my life was different. So once we had our children, I had great closure. And I really want other women and couples to have that same level of closure and that same thrill of parenthood that I've been able to experience.
Thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much, and I love the way you talk about these things. I feel like this is a really fascinating interview for my audience because, again, this is not really a topic that I've even heard a lot about. So unless you're kind of seeking it, you wouldn't really know all of this really cool stuff that we learned today. And so before I close out the interview, I did want to ask you just to talk a little bit about how Egg Donor USA supports members of the LGBTQ community. I know we've kind of talked about it throughout the podcast, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about the experience and how it might differ from the experience of a heterosexual couple or even a single woman, for example.
So Donor Egg Bank USA, we work with many members of the community, and we have a growing group of couples that come to us because with frozen egg, so it's increasingly convenient for particularly gay men or transsexuals that need to have a carrier because they can identify the carrier that they're most comfortable with, and that carrier can be anywhere in the United States, and we'll just send the eggs to them. So these couples also like the assured refund plan because it does give them those multiple tries. And if you're utilizing a carrier, you really want to do a single embryo back because your costs go higher if she's carrying twins or triplets. So they get multiple tries, one embryo back into the uterus each time, and they know exactly, they can predict their cost as part of the process. And those eggs can stay on ice until the carrier is ready. And the carrier can choose when she wants to cycle. So it really works very well for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, so to close out the interview today, I just have a couple of final questions to ask. And so, after our discussion then about donor eggs and the IVF process, what would you say is the biggest myth about fertility that you would like to see corrected?
Oh my gosh, the biggest myth about fertility. I think I'd like probably the biggest myth, because I do work with the donor egg population, that maybe it's not really a myth, it's more of an education. I'd like women to be better educated that their fertility declines, and that the myth being that you can be in your 40s as much as 48 and still have a live birth. I mean, yeah, it happens, but it's like winning the lottery. So most women that are over the age of 45, they're utilizing an egg donor to become pregnant. And women should not have that false sense of hope that they can have a baby over the age of 45 on their own.
Mm-hmm. So important. What advice, if any, would you give to a couple who is struggling to conceive?
Go see a doctor. I have really, really good friends who kept on trying on their own, and I encouraged them to see their doctor, see a reproductive endocrinologist that specializes in this. And sure enough, she had bilateral tubal blockage, and they had to move directly into IVF. But they would have been frustrated for many years trying on their own to conceive, which could have done actual damage to their marriage.
Mm-hmm. Well, and last question. For a woman who's listening and she doesn't want to get pregnant now, maybe she's on the pill, she knows she wants to get pregnant at some point in the future. Would you have any advice for her?
Well, if she is nearing her mid-30s, then I would recommend that she consider freezing her eggs. She should do some research to identify the best program. We recently launched a company called Frozen Egg Bank Network. The concept behind Frozen Egg Bank Network is to help steer her into a program that is experienced both with freeze and thaw, and to work with an embryologist that's required to do quarterly compliance review to ensure that their technique remains solid.
Okay. Well, great words to end on. Well, Heidi, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge and wisdom with the audience. Like I said, this interview has been really fascinating for me because it's a lot different than some of the topics that I've talked about on the show. And so I'm really grateful that we had the opportunity to chat and to really delve into this topic and really just spread the word and increase awareness around the realities of egg donation.
Lisa, it's been awesome talking to you. I love what you do. I'm so glad to have had an opportunity to talk with your audience. So good luck to you.
Well, thank you so much. And for our listeners then who are inspired by what we talked about today, how would they find you and get more information about what you do?
So the company is Donor Egg Bank USA. It's on the web, www.donoreggbankusa. So they can just contact us via our contact form, call us. Registration is free. There's no cost to view the donors. The only time costs come to be is when they actually select a donor and take the donor off the database.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Heidi.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Heidi. IVF is becoming more and more common, and I really appreciate the opportunity to learn more about the process and also the differences between using your own eggs versus donor eggs, and how that makes a difference in terms of the effectiveness and depending on your age. I also really enjoyed learning more about the implications for members of the LGBTQ community who are also building their own families. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/88. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. And make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com and join my email list. If you have an idea for a podcast episode or a guest suggestion, send me an email at info@fertilityfriday.com. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I appreciate all of you for taking the time to tune into the podcast and let me be part of your day. So thanks again. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.